June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. Over 300 Japanese aircraft, launched in 4 massive waves, are racing toward 15 American carriers, expecting another victory. Their pilots have spent years believing the same thing: the Zero can turn tighter, climb faster, and outmaneuver anything America can put in the sky. But this time, something is waiting for them. Hundreds of American fighters are already climbing toward the incoming swarm, and among them is a big, blunt fighter Japanese pilots once dismissed as too heavy, too slow, and too awkward to be a serious threat: the F6F Hellcat. Within hours, that assumption will collapse. By nightfall, hundreds of Japanese aircraft will be gone, while American losses in air combat remain astonishingly low. The survivors will describe the battle with a phrase that sounds almost unbelievable: a turkey shoot. But here's the part they couldn't know. The Hellcat's dominance wasn't born on June 19, 1944. 2 years earlier, an almost forgotten test pilot climbed into a captured Japanese Zero that American officers considered too valuable and too dangerous to fly. He pushed it harder than anyone had before and discovered a weakness that changed how American pilots fought the most feared fighter in the Pacific. His name was Eddie R. Sanders. And what he discovered inside that stolen Zero would help turn the Hellcat into the aircraft that broke Japan's naval air power. To understand why Sanders' flights mattered, you have to understand what American pilots were up against before the Hellcat existed. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero entered combat in 1940 over China and had already run up a kill ratio of roughly 12-1 before Japan ever attacked Pearl Harbor. It could outturn, outclimb, and outrange almost anything the Allies could put in the air. In April 1942, 36 Zeros met 60 British aircraft over Ceylon and shot down 27 of them for the loss of 1 Zero. By the time American pilots met it in the Pacific, the official doctrine for a lone fighter jumped by a Zero was blunt and humiliating: run. The reason was baked into the airframe itself. Japanese designer Jiro Horikoshi had built the Zero around one unforgiving trade: strip away everything that wasn't speed or agility. No armor plate behind the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, a featherweight structure that turned on a dime and climbed like nothing else in the sky. And that burned and came apart the moment American gunfire found it. But American pilots didn't know that yet. All they knew was that their Grumman F4F Wildcats, brave and rugged as they were, could not turn with a Zero, could not outclimb a Zero, and were dying because of it. Naval aviators like Lieutenant Commander John Thatch had already worked out a defensive maneuver. Pilots would come to call it the Thatch Weave, where 2 Wildcats crossed paths to lure a pursuing Zero into a crossfire. It was clever. It was also, fundamentally, a workaround for a fighter that simply couldn't win a fair fight. The Navy knew it needed a Wildcat successor. Grumman had actually been sketching one since before Pearl Harbor: a heavier, harder-hitting aircraft built around a new 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney engine, drafted in specifications dated as early as February 1941. But drawings on paper are not the same as a fighter that can outfly the deadliest plane in the Pacific, and nobody at Grumman or the Bureau of Aeronautics had ever gotten their hands on an intact Zero to test their assumptions against. Every American aviator who tangled with one came home with theories, guesses, half-formed instincts about what made the thing so lethal. None of it was proof. Intelligence files described light construction and thin armor from a distance, the kind of thing you can read in a report and still not understand in a cockpit. Nobody had flown one. Nobody knew for certain where its edges were, the speed at which its controls locked up, the maneuver that could break its pursuit, the one weakness buried inside all that maneuverability. The stakes were not abstract. Every week without an answer meant more Wildcat pilots dead over Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea, More carriers risking their air groups against a fighter that, on paper, still owned the sky. The Navy needed the truth about the Zero, not more educated guesses. And on June 4, 1942, without anyone planning it, the truth fell out of the sky and into an Alaskan swamp. His name, as we said, was Eddie R. Sanders. In September 1942, he was a lieutenant commander stationed at Naval Air Station Anacostia, a working test pilot, not an aeronautical engineer, not a fighter ace, not the Zero specialist the Navy would have hand-picked if it had time to choose one. He had no combat kills to his name. His job, up to that point, was flying whatever new aircraft crossed his desk and writing up how it handled. That, it turned out, was exactly the qualification nobody else had. 2 months earlier, on June 4, 1942, a 19-year-old Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga had crash-landed his Zero on the soft tundra of Akutan Island in the Aleutians during the raid on Dutch Harbor. The aircraft flipped on impact and Koga was killed instantly, but the airframe stayed almost completely intact. A Navy patrol plane spotted the wreckage more than a month later, on July 10th. After a difficult recovery through Aleutian mud and weather, the aircraft, serial number 4593, was shipped south to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. Navy mechanics rebuilt it almost entirely from its own salvaged parts, straightening the tail, repairing the landing gear, redressing the original propeller. They painted American star insignia over the red Hinomaru roundels. And then the Navy had to decide what to do with the only flyable Japanese Zero in Allied hands. This is where Sanders' lack of a fixed specialty became the point. He wasn't sent to disassemble the Zero for its engineering secrets. He was ordered out to San Diego in early September 1942 to do the one thing a test pilot does: strap in, take off, and find out how the aircraft actually behaved. Not on paper, not in a wind tunnel, but in the air, at the speeds and angles a dogfight would actually demand. On September 20th, 1942, Sanders took Koga's Zero up for its first flight in American hands. He would fly it 24 times over the next 25 days. A punishing, deliberate stress test of an enemy fighter that no other American had ever had the chance to push to its limits. His moment of insight came almost immediately, on that very first flight. Climbing and diving, rolling left and right, pushing the little fighter through the same violent maneuvers a Zero pilot would use to escape a pursuer, Sanders felt something no report, no photograph, and no debriefing from a frightened Wildcat pilot could have told him. Above roughly 200 knots, the Zero's ailerons went stiff and sluggish. The plane's famous agility simply vanished. And every time he pushed the nose over into a dive with negative G-force, the engine coughed and cut out, starved by its old-fashioned float-type carburetor. He hadn't found this in a blueprint. He'd found it with his hands on the stick, doing something the Navy's own engineers back in Washington were not equipped or inclined to do. The workshop, in this story, wasn't a garage full of spare parts. It was a guarded hangar at North Island, ringed by a wooden stockade and armed Marines, holding the single most valuable captured aircraft the United States possessed in the entire Pacific War. There was no room for a second prototype. 04593 wasn't a proof of concept. It was the only one, rebuilt from a swamp wreck with fabricated replacement parts and a propeller that had been dressed and reused rather than swapped for new. If Sanders put it into the Pacific Ocean on Flight 3, there would be no Flight 4, and no second chance to learn what he was learning. That risk was exactly why some officers in naval intelligence wanted the aircraft grounded. Ship it to Wright Field. Ship it to the Naka wind tunnel at Langley. Study it from the outside, methodically, the way you were supposed to study a captured enemy weapon. Not hand it to a single pilot to throw around the sky over San Diego on his own judgment. To men used to careful engineering evaluation, what Sanders was proposing sounded less like testing and more like recklessness with the nation's most valuable piece of enemy hardware. You cannot fly that thing like it's disposable. It is the only one we have. Sanders flew it anyway, with authorization, but against real institutional nerves, and on September 20th, 1942, took Koga's Zero into the air for the first time. He came back with an answer nobody in Washington could have written on a blackboard. The Zero froze up above 200 knots, and its engine choked in a dive. By his fourth or fifth flight, Sanders wasn't just testing performance figures. He was staging mock combat, putting the Zero through the exact fights American pilots were losing in the Pacific, rolling hard right into its weak side, diving away using -G to open the range while the enemy engine sputtered. Each flight sharpened the picture. Each flight was also another roll of the dice, with an aircraft that could not be replaced. The Navy backed him. 24 flights, 25 days, no crash. And on October 15, 1942, Sanders wrote up what those flights had found. At low speed, in a classic dogfight turn, the Zero was still the most dangerous fighter in the sky. But above 200 knots, rolling to the right, its ailerons locked up like they'd been welded. Push the nose over hard enough, and its engine would quit cold. That report went out to the fleet almost immediately. Word came back fast, and it came back exactly the way you want it to when a theory meets a cockpit. It works. Sanders' report solved the immediate crisis. American pilots now had a script for surviving a Zero on their tail. But surviving a Zero was not the same as building a fighter that could hunt one. That fight happened somewhere far less dramatic than a dogfight, inside the Bureau of Aeronautics and on the drafting floor at Grumman's Bethpage plant, where the future F6F Hellcat was already deep into development. Grumman's designers had a decision to make, and it split the room. The XF6F1 prototype had first flown on June 26, 1942, before Sanders ever touched Koga's Zero, powered by a Wright R2600 engine that gave good enough performance on paper. Some engineers argued that was sufficient. The design was locked, the timeline was tight, the Navy needed fighters in the Pacific. Now. And re-engineering the aircraft around a bigger engine risked delaying production the fleet couldn't afford to wait for. Others argued the opposite, that a fighter merely as fast as a Zero wasn't good enough, because the whole point was to win at the speeds where the Zero lost its edge. That case, in the summer of 1942, was built on early combat reports and hard-won instinct rather than hard data. Sanders' formal findings wouldn't reach the fleet until mid-October. Feedback from combat pilots like Butch O'Hare pushed hard in that direction too. The argument, by every account, got loud. Careers and deadlines were on the line, and for a moment, the entire redesign hung in the balance. It was Grumman's leadership, willing to gamble a production schedule against a better airplane, who overruled the caution and pushed the switch to the far more powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the same engine going into the Corsair and the Army's P-47. The re-engined prototype, redesignated XF6F3, took to the air on July 30, 1942, a bet placed on instinct and early combat reports alone. It would take Sanders' report, still 2.5 months away, to prove that bet had been the right one. The extra speed and power Grumman gambled on was exactly what let the Hellcat fight the Zero above the 200-knot threshold where the Zero came apart. If you're the kind of person who wants the real engineering fight behind the machines that decided the Pacific War, not just the highlight reel, hit subscribe now. This channel exists to dig up the decisions nobody put in the textbooks. The production F6F3, the version that would actually reach the fleet, flew for the first time on October 3, 1942, just 2 weeks after Sanders' first flight in the Zero, and 12 days before his formal report went out. In February 1943, the first Hellcats reached VF9 aboard the brand-new USS Essex. By August, they were in combat over Marcus Island. The fighter the Navy needed had arrived in under 18 months, from prototype to war zone, an astonishing pace for any aircraft, let alone one built to dethrone the most feared fighter plane in the world. The numbers, once the Hellcat reached the fleet, were almost impossible to believe. On November 23, 1943, Hellcats engaged Japanese Zeros over Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands and came home with 30 kills for the loss of a single American fighter. That wasn't a fluke. Over the entire war, F6F Hellcat pilots would be credited with destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft while losing just 270 of their own in air-to-air combat, a kill ratio of roughly 19-1, the highest of any American fighter in World War II. 305 Hellcat pilots became aces. But the number that mattered most came on June 19, 1944, over the Philippine Sea, the battle we opened with. That morning, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched everything Japan had left in carrier aviation, over 300 aircraft in 4 massive waves, against Task Force 58. American radar picked them up 60 to 150 miles out. Hellcats were airborne and climbing before the Japanese formations even reached the fleet. Lieutenant, junior grade, Alexander Vrachu found a formation of Japanese dive bombers pressing toward the American carriers, closed in, and in about 8 minutes shot down 6 of them. Commander David McCampbell, leading Fighter Squadron 15 off the USS Essex, downed 5 Japanese dive bombers in a single engagement that day, part of a run that would eventually make him the Navy's top ace of the war, with 34 confirmed kills, and earn him the Medal of Honor. By the end of the day, Japan had lost somewhere between 325 and 346 aircraft. The United States had lost roughly 30 in the air. Back aboard the Lexington, one exhausted young pilot summed up what everyone in the ready room already knew. It had been like an old-fashioned turkey shoot. The name stuck instantly, and it has been the battle's name in every history book since. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For the Japanese pilots who survived it, the psychological shock was as brutal as the losses themselves. Their entire doctrine had been built on the assumption that a Zero could outturn and outclimb anything the Americans sent up, an assumption that had been true in 1941 and 1942, when green American pilots died proving it. By June 1944, that assumption was a death sentence. Japan's best, most experienced aviators were already gone, lost over the Coral Sea, Midway, and the long, grinding campaigns since, replaced by pilots with a fraction of the flight hours of the Americans now hunting them in faster, better armored, harder-hitting fighters. Survivors of the battle described watching their formations disintegrate before they ever reached the American fleet, cut apart by fighters that shouldn't, by the old rules of 1942, have been able to catch them at all. If a single test pilot's 24 flights in a broken enemy fighter changing the entire trajectory of the Pacific War is the kind of history that gets you, drop a like and tell us in the comments which forgotten name from this war you want us to dig up next. The human cost the Hellcat prevented is not an abstraction. Every one of the roughly 305 Hellcat aces, every pilot who came home from a fight a Wildcat pilot wouldn't have survived 2 years earlier, represents a version of the war that didn't have to end in a telegram to a family back home. Veterans who flew the Hellcat in combat would say, decades later, that they knew, the moment they strapped into that cockpit instead of a Wildcat, that their odds of coming home had just changed. As one veteran later put it to his own children, "Because of that airplane, we came home to raise you." By the time Japan surrendered, Grumman had built 12,275 Hellcats in just 30 months at its Bethpage plant, a rate of production the Japanese aircraft industry, stretched thin and pounded by American bombing, could never hope to match. The Hellcat accounted for 75% of all U.S. Navy and Marine Corps aerial victories in the Pacific theater. It had done exactly what it was built to do: turn a fair fight into a massacre in America's favor. The Zero, meanwhile, never recovered. Stripped of its early advantage, the moment American fighters caught up in speed, armor, and firepower, later models of Japan's once dominant fighter were increasingly flown by barely trained pilots and, by the war's final year, expended in kamikaze attacks rather than air-to-air combat. Eddie Sanders went on to a full Navy career and retired a Rear Admiral. He rarely spoke about those 24 flights as anything heroic. In his own telling, decades later, he described simply doing the job the Navy asked of him: fly the aircraft, write down what it did, and let the fleet decide what to do with the answer. He gave interviews late in his life, plainly and without embellishment, still able to recite the exact dates of his flight log from memory, September 20 to October 15, 1942, but never claiming more credit than the record actually supported. Historians still argue, honestly, over exactly how much those 24 flights changed the outcome of the war versus tactics American pilots were already discovering the hard way in combat. Sanders himself never tried to settle that argument in his own favor. What isn't in dispute is what came after him. The tactics born from those flights, the diving escape, the roll to the right, the refusal to turn fight a Zero, spread through the fleet within weeks and saved pilots' lives before the Hellcat ever existed. And the fighter, those same lessons helped shape, went on to break Japanese naval air power for good over the Philippine Sea. Today, a handful of airworthy F6F Hellcats still fly at air shows across the United States, maintained by warbird collectors and veterans organizations who understand exactly what that blunt, unglamorous airframe accomplished. Naval aviation instructors still teach the basic principles Sanders proved in 1942 in a stolen enemy fighter over the California coast. You cannot outturn every threat, but you can find its edges, and you can build, or fly, around them. It's a lesson with no ambition attached to it, discovered by a man who never asked for the myth-sized version of his own story. Sometimes winning the fight isn't about genius. It's about being willing to climb into the thing everyone else is afraid to touch, and simply telling the truth about what you find.